Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating and, honestly, a completely bizarre deep dive into a really dark, kind of forgotten corner of historical law. We're talking about a time when the boundaries between human justice and the animal kingdom just literally blurred together. If you're someone who loves digging into the strange mechanisms of history, well, you are definitely in the right place. So let's jump right in. Right off the bat, I want to ask you something pretty jarring. Can a dog be a criminal? Now, to our modern minds, that's just an absolutely absurd proposition, right? We know animals operate on instinct. But if you were to ask a secular or religious judge in Europe or colonial America between the 14th and 18th centuries, well, their answer wouldn't just be a firm yes, it would be backed up by the full, incredibly brutal weight of their entire legal system. Okay, let's dive into this. To really wrap our heads around this era, we have to grasp this concept of a moral agent. During the Middle Ages and the early modern period, the legal systems didn't just see animals as mindless property in these specific cases. Instead, under both religious and secular statutes, they treated animals as moral agents, entities capable of actually literally sinning against divine and natural law. So if a human was accused of a capital crime like bestiality or buggery, the animal involved wasn't viewed as a victim, no way. The animal was legally charged as an accomplice, a formal active co-defendant in the crime. And looking at this timeline, you can see this wasn't just some one-off mistake or an isolated fluke by a rogue judge somewhere. Spanning hundreds of years, from the Jean Baness case in 1468 all the way to the Potter case in 1662, prosecuting farm animals and pets was a widespread, deeply systemic phenomenon. We're talking about standard legal procedure that lasted multiple centuries and even crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Section 1. The French Purifications, Fire and Brimstone. Let's look at how this builds by starting in medieval and early modern France. The secular laws governing these acts were swift, they were absolute, and they were entirely defined by a fiery retribution that was specifically designed to completely cleanse a community. We see this incredibly vividly in the 1468 case of a peasant named Jean Baness. So Baness was caught and charged with committing a sexual crime with a cow on one occasion and a goat on another. Now, under medieval French secular law, any livestock involved in these crimes was deemed permanently corrupted. The rationale was that they were entirely unfit to exist in the human world anymore. So after Baness was convicted and ordered to be executed, the completely innocent cow and goat were cast right alongside him into a massive public bonfire, and all three of them were burned alive. Moving chronologically, we hit 1539 with the case of Guillaume Garnier. Garnier was accused of a similar crime, this time involving a female domestic dog. The judicial authorities were just relentless here. They actually subjected Garnier to severe judicial torture until they finally extracted a full confession for the act. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the absolutely twisted irony of the sentencing. The judge actually showed a tiny measure of mercy to the human, ordering Garnier to be strangled to death first so he wouldn't have to feel the flames before his body was burned. But the court showed absolutely zero leniency to the innocent animal. The dog was cast directly into the flames while still completely alive. And the courts were so deeply terrified of the spiritual implications of this crime that they went a step further. The judge ordered that the actual physical paper trail and written records of Garnier's trial be thrown into the fire right along with the dog. Why? Well, because the court officially declared the details too horrible and potentially dangerous to be permitted to exist in human memory. Think about that for a second. They literally tried to burn the memory out of history. By 1601, this mindset was still firmly in place. Take the case of Claudine de Coulomb. She was a 16-year-old French girl accused by her own neighbors of engaging in unnatural acts with the family dog. The authorities didn't just seize the girl, they arrested the dog as well, treating this teenager and her pet as literal co-conspirators in a capital crime against divine law. The procedural absurdity here is just stunning. They were actually arrested together, and the dog was physically brought into a formal courtroom to stand trial. A secular judge found them both guilty. Then, in this grand public spectacle meant to purify the whole community, the 16-year-old girl and the dog were hanged together on the exact same gallows, and their bodies were subsequently burned to ashes. Section 2. The Puritan Massacres, Old Testament Retribution. Now, we're going to shift our geographical focus across the Atlantic to colonial America. Here, the legal framework changes a bit, from French secular law over to strict religious doctrine. But the results? Just as brutal. The strict Puritan legal code demanded absolute retribution, and this was driven by a literal interpretation of Old Testament law, specifically Leviticus 20:15, which explicitly states that if a man lies with a beast, both absolutely must be put to death. This brings us to one of the earliest recorded capital trials in colonial American history, the 1642 case of a teenage servant named Thomas Granger in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Granger was detected committing these acts, and his indictment included a jaw-dropping variety of animals. We're talking a mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and even a turkey. The surreal reality of formally executing a turkey is just hard to wrap your head around. 11. That's the staggering total number of animals systematically indicted here. To strictly obey their literal interpretation of religious law, the Puritan magistrates created a genuinely horrifying scene. They forced the teenager to stand there and watch as all 11 animals, ranging from heavy horses all the way down to that turkey, were systematically slaughtered, butchered, and thrown into a massive pit right before his very eyes. And only after that was Granger himself finally hanged. And this exact Puritan template was used again 20 years later. In 1662, William Potter, a 60-year-old highly respected church member in New Haven, Connecticut, was executed after confessing to a lifetime of hidden carnal acts with various farm animals. The grim execution toll from Potter's confession was huge. The authorities marched Potter to the execution site where executioners publicly slaughtered 3 cows, 3 sheep, and 2 pigs, one by one, right in front of him, just like in the Plymouth case. Their carcasses were tossed into an unmarked pit to completely obliterate any memory of the transgression. And once that grim work was done, Potter was sent to the gallows. Section 3. The Systemic Truth. Why did they do this? Looking back at centuries of this bizarre, brutal theater, we really have to ask the pivotal question, why? Why on earth did these human communities go to such incredible, frankly absurd lengths to formally try and execute livestock and family pets?
So the crucial point is this. History never actually viewed these animals as willing participants or lovers. Not at all. They were entirely helpless property. These trials and executions served as public theatrical spectacles. The primary goal here was to restore what the community believed was a fractured spiritual balance. They saw the sin as a deep stain on the entire town, and in their minds, only blood and fire could wash it clean and make sure no unnatural offspring could ever exist. The secondary goal was restoring social order by loudly, very publicly, reestablishing the absolute authority of their divine and secular laws.
I think this quote straight from our source material grounds the historical tragedy perfectly. These animals were simply caught in ancient legal systems that used brutal spectacles of animal execution to restore what they believed was a fractured spiritual and social balance. It really wasn't about punishing a bad dog or an evil cow. It was entirely about human beings desperately trying to cleanse their own communities of an invisible, terrifying spiritual threat. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. When we look at these medieval and early modern cases, we can so clearly see communities using their legal systems to manage their own profound cultural and spiritual fears. So it makes you wonder, if these brutal laws were just reflections of their community fears, what completely normalized aspects of our modern legal systems will future generations look back on and judge as pure absurdity? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating explainer with me. Keep asking questions and keep learning.